I'm very happy to introduce today's guest. He's a good friend, and he is the visiting professor of American Studies here at AB. Sam Haselby is a historian of 18th and early 19th century American political culture. He earned his PhD in history at Columbia University. It's very interesting. I'm going to give a talk in Korea on the Ballet Russe next week. And Lynn Garofalo, who's a scholar of dance at Barnard in New York, which is the sister college of Columbia, it turns out curated a very interesting show on dance in New York with Eric Foner, who is, as you may know, perhaps the premier historian in the United States with whom Sam worked. And I was quite astonished, and I'm always pleased to see those sorts of connections. So he earned his PhD in history at Columbia University in New York. He also worked as a journalist, publishing over 40 articles in the history of material culture. He taught history and religious studies at the New School University in New York before becoming a junior fellow at the Hartford Society of Fellows. He recently finished The Origins of American Religious Nationalism, 1776 to 1832, a book on the role of religion in the formation of American nationality. And his talk today is entitled Songs of a Nation, The Origins of the American Missions Movement. Please welcome Dr. Sam.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone, is that okay? You can hear? Okay. This talk is about where the American missions movement came from, in fact. AUB is perhaps the greatest achievement in many respects of the missions movement. So to give a talk on it here is for me especially exciting, and I would like to thank Robert Myers, Chairman of the Center for American Studies and Research, and Patrick McGreevy, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And thank you all for coming too. The American missions movement is also a subject that's familiar to many people here, so I will try to limit myself to one point that has not emerged from the excellent literature on this subject. Much of it by people associated with the university. In brief, the American missions movement began as basically the first form of American nationality that was then gone into exile, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. It was created by a distinct and eventually embattled group of New Englanders who failed in their first ambition, which was to nationalize and to run the United States. And so they turned to founding, and they turned to missions and colleges, both of which they did very well at. They had a 3-decade first act of public life as Protestant literary intellectuals, and they first tried to nationalize America through literature. To give you a sense of how a small literary movement with more cultural than political or economic capital tells us something about the missions movement, I'm going to take you to look very briefly at 3 dates in American history. 1769, the election of 1800, and then very briefly December of 1814 and January of 1815. I'm going to talk for 30 minutes, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions if there are any. First, the summer of 1769, in New Haven, Connecticut, is the Yale College commencement. Timothy Dwight and John Trumbull, who are 2 of the leading sons of New England, disrupt the college commencement by staging a nationalist demonstration. Trumbull's valedictory address is called An Essay on the Use and Advantage of the Fine Arts. Despite the refined title, his address is actually a provocative call for nationalist revolution and an American-led world empire. There are a couple of interesting things about Trumbull's address, but the most important one is the date of 1769. Benjamin Franklin, who has been called the first American, did not become an American nationalist until 1774. George Washington has also been called the first American and did not come to support American independence until 1775. In fact, it was Timothy Dwight and John Trumbull who gave the first open call from the colonial elite for American independence. Their nationalism was nurtured in the context of a small literary movement that coalesced at Yale in New Haven in the 1760s. They called themselves the Connecticut Wits. American national glory was their consuming theme. I'll give you a few of their titles just to give you an idea. David Humphreys, one of the Connecticut Wits, wrote Address to the Armies of the United States of America in 1780. The Future Glory of the United States of America in 1782. A Poem on the Happiness of America, 1785. The Industry of the United States of America, 1802. These are all poems. John Trumbull wrote Prospect of the Future Glory of America in 1770. The Genius of America, an Ode in 1777. Trumbull also wrote a poem called Infingal, or McFingal. This was the most successful of any of their writings. Nobody has reads it today. McFingal, a Modern Epic Poem was the title. It was published in January of 1776. After its publication, it sold 30 editions. It would be 75 years before another American poem. It was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Evangeline in 1847, went through 30 editions. And Longfellow's poem did it when the population was, I think, 15 million. Trumbull's poem did it when the American population was 3 million. Of the Connecticut Wits, though, even they concurred that Timothy Dwight was their star. Timothy Dwight was a descendant of some of the most eminent Puritan theologians of the past century and a half. It was this lineage that helped Dwight to authorize turning New England Congregationalists to missions, which were antithetical to 200 years of Puritan theology. Dwight's father, also named Timothy Dwight, was a large landowner and known as the first citizen of Northampton, Massachusetts. So Timothy Dwight was something of a prince of both the New England clerical and commercial classes. By age 4, he could recite large portions of the King James Bible. By age 8, he sight-read Latin and Greek. As a college student, he spent every day of an entire year from dawn to midnight studying the works of Isaac Newton. He and the other Connecticut Wits thought that he was going to be the American Virgil. He tried for 25 years to assume that position. The American writer Henry Adams once described Timothy Dwight as, quote, a man on whom almost every other mental gift had been conferred in fuller measure than poetical genius. His epic poem, Conquest of Canaan, intersperses events from the Hebrew Scriptures with battles of the American Revolution. The Israelites become the Americans, the Egyptians become the British, and Joshua and George Washington blend into the same figure. It typified their literary style. Neoclassicism, resounding with events and characters of the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly the Hebrew Scriptures. And they identified strongly with the Hebrew Scriptures, specifically because they identified with the Israelites' trajectory from imperial provincials to world historical figures. And then these poems, their style also was to include many references to modern British literature in their neoclassical epics. So by any time they tried to Christianize and modernize the classical epic and make it an American form. The Conquest of Canaan, however, was one of the great failures in the history of American literature. It is 11 books, nearly 10,000 lines long, and there may not be a soul alive who can quote 2 of its lines. The important point, however, is that Timothy Dwight began writing it in 1771. In 1771, nobody was an American nationalist except for this group of writers, the Connecticut Wits. When the support for the American Revolution did come together, when from their perspective the world had caught up with them, the coalition was a fragile one. In very general terms, the revolution had 3 distinct bases of support. There were artisans and small-scale capitalists based in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, the middle colonies. The planters of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, and the acutely Protestant, meaning the basically Congregationalist and Presbyterian New Englanders, especially from southern England. Tom Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, the most widely read English language pamphlet of the 18th century, represented the civic republican case for the American Revolution. Paine's brand of civic capitalism found its most positive reception in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, the middle colonies. And it was no accident that Paine, who was an English corset maker, emigrated from England to Philadelphia, not to Boston or to Charleston. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, and many other important revolutionaries were, of course, Southern slaveholders. It was these planters of whom the English writer Samuel Johnson in 1775 asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, who were the great winners of the American Revolution? Nowhere else in the world did a class of slaveholders control the state, much less of such a dynamic society as the United States was. The American missions movement did not come from them. They disapproved of it and in private they mocked it. The missions movement came from New England. And New England occupies a peculiar place in the history of American nationality. In some respects, the region was the big loser in the creation of the American Republic. Yet not only were New Englanders the first American nationalists, they gave the strongest and deepest support to the revolution. In other parts of the colonies, up to 30% of the population remained loyal to Great Britain. Canadians rejected several invitations and one invasion by the American patriots to join the revolution. Large parts of the backcountry in Virginia, the Carolinas, and northern New England were indifferent and considered the revolution at best an unwelcome disruption. New York City and Charleston, South Carolina, the richest city in the colonies, both of them remained loyalist pro-British cities. New England, and it was really southern New England, meaning Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, was different. It offered the most ferocious and uncompromising resistance to Britain and constituted, in a sense, the Al-Anbar province of the American Revolution. It was of these New Englanders that Edmund Burke, the conservative British political thinker and the pro-American parliamentarian, spoke in 1775 when he warned Parliament that the Americans would not acquiesce. They are, Burke said, the kind of Protestants, quote, most adverse to all implicit submission of mind and opinion. Their religion, Burke said, is a refinement on the principle of resistance. It is the dissidence of dissent. It is the Protestantism of the Protestant religion. Parliament did not take Burke's advice to compromise, and his warning proved prescient. The point here, though, is really that in the context of the American colonies and in the American Revolution, only New England had a political culture that was so strongly informed by dissenting Protestantism. After the Revolution, the Connecticut Whigs continued writing, trying to nationalize the United States through literature. In retrospect, their agenda to make the New England way the American way and to do it through literature seems quixotic. But it is helpful to bear in mind that they were very young men who had already won two very large and improbable victories. First, their exceptionally early advocacy of American nationalism made them feel like visionaries, and they really were years ahead of their compatriots. And secondly, the victory against Great Britain imbued them with a sense of millennial possibility. If they, a raggedy group of disaffected provincials, could defeat the mightiest empire in the world, could they not convince a few South Carolinians and Pennsylvanians to turn to the New England way? As it turned out, they could not. Their final attempt to do so through literature came in 1794. In that year, Timothy Dwight published another epic poem. This one is called Greenfield Hill. Greenfield Hill is basically a thick description of the kind of society that they hoped America would become. It was also, in essence, the social philosophy behind the missions movement. As an epigraph, Dwight chose a line that he had been using with slight variations since his time as a chaplain in the Revolutionary Army. And that epigraph was, "Allow me to write the songs of a nation, and you may make its laws." The line is sometimes attributed to Plato, but it seems to be of an uncertain origin. In any event, the phrase indicated his understanding that in the United States of America, the middle colonies, and especially the South, were going to have much more political and economic capital than New England. Greenfield Hill, however, also failed, and its failure as literature, and its failure prompted Dwight in the following year, in 1795, to accept a position as the president of Yale College. He had also been offered the position 15 years earlier when he was 25 years old, and then declined. 5 years into Dwight's Yale presidency, the election of 1800, this is the second date I want to look at, just to visit briefly. 5 years into his Yale presidency, the election of 1800, with the election of 1800, the end of any possibility that the New England way would become the American way began to come into clear focus. Thomas Jefferson, a man many New England Federalists considered not just an opponent, but an enemy, a heretic, a crypto-anarchist, and an immoral slaver, not only won the presidency, defeating their man, John Adams, he won it without a single electoral vote from New England. The same year, one of Dwight's proxies, the lexicographer Noah Webster, warned that if Americans voted Jefferson into the White House, the nation would be turning its back on the New England aristocracy's unique historical accomplishments. The New England aristocracy, Webster wrote, had produced a society where, quote, people enjoyed a longer period of uninterrupted freedom than any spot on the globe. They were, he wrote, the freest people in the world. Webster, incidentally, went on to found Amherst College. Assessing Webster's boast that New England elites had produced the freest society in the world depends on what kind of freedom one values. If freedom means libertarian freedom from state regulation, the claim was absurd. Both Massachusetts and Connecticut claimed the right to take children judged by selectmen, by the town council, basically. Massachusetts and Connecticut claimed the right to remove from children judged by the town council to be, quote, ignorant from their parents and, quote, put them in better hands. Massachusetts forbade anyone not worth 200 pounds sterling, which is quite a bit of money, actually, from, quote, wearing gold or silver or lace or buttons or bone lace above 2 shillings per yard or silk hoods or scarves. Massachusetts and Connecticut both prohibited travel on the Sabbath, which began at Saturday on sundown. And these weren't mere paper prohibitions either. Even in the 19th century, Massachusetts officials had members of their own judiciary arrested for traveling on Sunday. Freedom of religion, if it can be called that, in fact, existed for Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Anglicans. And it only existed for Anglicans because they had a long history as a royal colony and would have been very difficult not to grant Anglicans freedom of religion. Anglicans being the state church of Britain, of course. The right of the franchise, that is the right to vote, depended on being a member in good standing of one of these churches. Massachusetts allowed any, quote, this is quoting from Massachusetts statute, quote, any person or persons to apprehend without warrant any Jesuit, priest, missionary, or Roman ecclesiastic. Quakers faced a special brand of New England hospitality. In Massachusetts, they could be executed. Connecticut allowed, among other punishments, the boring of their tongues, a procedure for which the state also billed them. Playing cards, as well as, quote, dice, shuffleboard, billiards, was illegal throughout New England. As late as 1812, the Justice of the Peace of North Haven, Connecticut, arrested 7 young men for card playing. They were prosecuted, convicted, and fined. In 18th century Connecticut, it was illegal to fly a kite. In short, a broad range of individual expression was not a premium part of the kind of freedom cherished by the New England missionaries. In other ways, Noah Webster's boast that New England was an unusually free, stable, and egalitarian society, however, was true. 18th century New England, for instance, was one of the most literate societies in human history. Its burning Protestantism led to near universal male literacy. Only Scotland and Sweden enjoyed comparable literacy rates to New England. For New England men born around 1730, 90% were literate. In England, as well as Pennsylvania, it was 60%. In France, it was at most 50%. New England in 1800 knew poverty and it knew social strife, and as with literacy, both were on the rise. Unlike England, however, New England had no large, illiterate, and dispossessed laboring class. Unlike the Chesapeake, the Caribbean colonies, and Spanish South America, it also lacked a mass of enslaved laborers. The colonial New England economy was not based on industrialism or plantation agriculture or natural resource extraction, all of which required a brutalized and dispossessed labor force and tended to produce a very small, very rich elite. Small-scale agriculture, husbandry, and merchant commerce that formed the basis of the New England economy produced, by the standards of the early modern Atlantic world, relative social equality. In all of these ways, Webster's claim that New Englanders are, quote, independent landholders, free and accustomed to managing their own concerns was true. Webster was also referring to their rejection of primogeniture. New Englanders considered the fact that they had always been able to distribute their property as they saw fit to be a signal step in the history of human freedom. Primogeniture is the practice of inheriting all the, giving the oldest son all of the property. In fact, the Connecticut wits had devised a whole theory of European imperialism based on primogeniture. In Greenfield Hill, Timothy Dwight attributed European colonialism to the presidents of decadent and idle oldest sons. No entail, he wrote, the firstborn lifting into bloated pomp. Without a class of decadent and idle oldest sons, New England, he said, had been spared, quote, the lust and sloth and pride and rage that afflicted the social relations of Europe and the American South. New England also lacked a class, this was the wits, again boasting about New England's distinctiveness, a class of dispossessed and desperate younger sons whose on-the-make errands they claimed were responsible for most colonial depredations. Dwight described these younger sons as, quote, hissing death and hurrying to, quote, gain a wigwam built on Nootka Sound or Falkland's fruitful isles. To their minds, the consequences of primogeniture on the social structure were difficult to exaggerate. The departure from the European practice of primogeniture exerted a strong influence on their social structure. One that reinforced other tendencies to relative egalitarianism and broadened participation in civic life. In addition, New England was the only part of the world settled by families instead of by single men. From the beginning, women constitute half the population of New England, more or less. The early presence of traditional family structures contributed to social stability and obviously altered the character of social life. New England town government was not the process of unanimity and consensus that later mythologizers claimed. In colonial New England overall, over 10 to 25% of eligible voters went to the polls. A turnout of 50% in an election was very rare. Nonetheless, over the course of the 18th century, New England civic life exhibited a vibrancy and stability that was unusual. Its characteristic event, the town meeting, has become something of an American political ritual. In belief, whatever the frame of reference may be, 18th century New England was a distinct and unusual society. When the missions movement thought of a godly society, that was the society they had in mind. When they thought of American empire, they thought of themselves as its natural leaders. The problem, however, was that they did not fare so well with the American people. Following their 1800 electoral defeat, they lost again in 1804, they lost again in 1808, and they lost again in 1812. The bigger America became, the greater were their defeats. In a phrase, the American missions movement emerged from this contradiction. Despite the fact that New England Protestants had been the first to be for an American empire, and the first to be for an American nation, the American nation was not for them. Their summary ending as a domestic political force came with the War of 1812. In that war between Britain and America, the primary beneficiaries were Western land interests and Southern planters. In New England, which was practically the left wing of the British merchant marine, the War of 1812 was deeply unwelcome. One of the many things New Englanders did to register their unhappiness about the War of 1812 was to turn to joint Anglo-American missionary activities. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions sent 3 missionaries to Sri Lanka, Ceylon at the time, on a British ship during the middle of the American War. Politicians from the South accused them of treason. Also in the middle of the war, New Englanders made the Scottish Anglican Claudius Buchanan's book, Christian Researches in Asia, in which Buchanan claimed to have discovered the lost tribes of Israel in Hindustan. It was really the St. Thomas Christians or Syrian Malabar Christians in Kerala, India. They made Buchanan's book one of the unlikeliest bestsellers in American history. Southern and Western politicians responded to New England's efforts, highlighting the joint Anglo-American missionary activities with further accusations of treason. 3 years into the war, New Englanders had had enough. And this is the final date, December 1814 and January of 1815. In December to January of 1814-15, calling themselves the Hartford Convention, 26 leading members of New England society met in Hartford, Connecticut. They met in the chamber of the Connecticut Senate. All 7 Connecticut delegates had been Timothy Dwight's students or friends from Yale. Several were senior members of the Yale administration. Dwight's brother Theodore served as the secretary of the convention, and his protege Noah Webster had organized it. The Hartford Convention sent, in February of 1815, sent a delegation to Washington, D.C., threatening secession from the United States. The problem for New Englanders was that, unbeknownst to them, due to the slowness of 19th century communications, in between the time their delegation threatening secession left Hartford and arrived in Washington, D.C., America won the war. So the New Englanders arrived in the nation's capital to denounce, in the strongest possible terms, a war that their country had just won. In the annals of political history, this remains an almost uniquely effective recipe for self-destruction. Thus discredited in American party politics, the New England Protestants, in effect, took their show on the road. By 1840, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions would support missionary endeavors in India, Sri Lanka, China, Burma, Singapore, Thailand, the Sandwich Islands, Athens, Beirut, Persia, Cyprus, Syria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and among the Zulus in southern Africa. The ABCFM would become probably the greatest transnational enterprise of 19th century America. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Yes, Iman is walking around with a microphone. I know that a number of people have questions because they stopped by and spoke to me about the relationship between Sam's talk and AB, and there are a number, and I'll let you get into that. What I was hoping you might talk about, and I became really sort of intrigued as you were talking, I know a bit about your work. Is there some sort of literary analogy we can make with figures in the 19th century later on, such as Whitman or Lincoln, who actually, and Lincoln came, of course, to mind, who sort of succeed in this mission of consolidating the notion of nationalism through literature. You see it with, say, Shafran here in Lebanon. It's funny to hear that they failed, and I wonder if you would just, sort of lend us your insights about whether or not you think that actually happened at a later point. And then we'll throw the floor open to some questions about AD and everything else?
That's a very good question. I actually hadn't quite thought of it that way before. I mean, historically, literary movements play a very distinctive role in the formations of nationalities. Most nationalist revolutions typically begin as literary movements. So it's not that aspect of it is unusual. Whitman and Lincoln were much better writers than the Connecticut was, where they wrote.
Just about every other one.
Well, they also wrote in a different genre that was more suitable to kind of capitalist democracy, the American population, the kind of country America was becoming. Whitman, of course, has this tremendous demonic energy, this disdain for form that would have severely displeased some of the Connecticut wits. They certainly would have approved of Lincoln's kind of Hebrew scripture sense of justice. Lincoln has Lincoln's second inaugural, which to my mind is one of the greatest pieces of writing in 19th century America, is infused with this sense of divine justice. This is the address in which he says, with charity for all, with charity for all, the malice towards none. That's often quoted. What's not often quoted is the line before that, where he says about the American Civil War, in which 600,000 people were killed. If every drop of blood drawn by the lash is repaid by another drawn with the sword, so as was said 2,000 years ago, must it be said again today, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And then he says, but with charity for all. So what he's saying is that this is a just, this catastrophic war is a just, is a form of justice. Not be nice to everybody necessarily. And the wits would have approved of that. They did have that sense of divine justice, but the kind of simple directness and popular form of both Whitman and Lincoln's writing wasn't even classical enough for them. But certainly literature is central to the history of nationality and national movement.
Oh, well, thank you. That actually does make this connection between Noel Ignatieff, who was, our CASAR site here last year, always talked about the American Civil War as the continuation and, in fact, the genuine American Revolution. So it's quite intriguing in this kind of division that you lay out between North and South, the reasons why they would have found a figure like Jefferson so abhorrent is really fascinating, especially to a Southerner like me.
Let me give one more small linguistic detail on that. Before the Civil War in the United States, the convention was to speak of it in the plural. The United States are. After the Civil War, it moves into the first person plural, and we say the United States is.
To what extent it actually what they called for has been accomplished, but they were not recognized in a sense. They lost the elections. The people not occupy the White House notion or whatever was there at that point. So in that sense, to what extent their failure affected the project itself. And the second question is about taking their show on the road. In what sense this show can be taken on the road? Part of it has to do with nationalization of the US. Is it this illusion, somebody who leaves the role and assumes another one, finding some little colony spots somewhere in the world where they are basically go academic, isolate yourself? To what extent it is a show taken on the road? To what extent that their national agenda, national agenda, has played any role in their later missionary activities? And it's, unclear.
I mean, the answer to your first question is mixed. Their great goal was nationalization and the creation of American nationality. And that was accomplished. The content of it was, to some of them, devastating and tragic. But they did accept it. They were, above all, nationalists. And it was not an easy. The creation of American nationality had tragic dimensions with it. Some aspects of what America became in the 19th century were very painful for them. The answer to your second question, I think, is more difficult. Maybe it's too soon to tell. I think what let's say it this way, their Protestantism, their Christianity, also gave them a kind of universality that made them ultimately more flexible about what was going to be the proper political community than other people were. But this I think emerges very clearly and correctly in some of Makdisi's book, is that that ideal of nationality is the kind of fruit of their tree from their missions, including in Beirut.
Yes, I'll take the mic. Thank you for showing.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much. I have a question which might come out a little bit ahistorical for you. I'm really interested in the way that you're using the idea of epic in the beginning of the, and I don't know if you're aware of this. I mean, one of the sort of granddaddies of epic literature, and particularly coming out of a Neo-Virgilian tradition, is David Quint at Yale, right? And Quint has this whole idea of the epic of the losers. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because you were talking about literary forms as somehow losers, right? And you were talking about how, and I assume what you mean is where form meets a literary market or a literary culture where the form is not distributed, is not, it doesn't receive an audience or simply doesn't get read. I guess that's what you were talking about. But I was wondering if you could comment just on maybe thinking about it in a different way. In other words, that perhaps these guys, these wits who were writing these things, they're actually losers in a game. Or are they actually losers in a game? And is that epic expression just pulling on a very, very strong tradition inside of epic literature of failure sort of giving rise to success or something like that? In other words, maybe you can connect this or just comment a little bit about that context of those particular poems inside of American epic. And because it's when I was listening to the content of them, I feel like the content is so complicit with later versions of American Empire. You know what I mean? So anyway.
They're amazing historical documents, but sort of Churchill's paintings. That's how I think of them. They're kind of like Winston Churchill's paintings or something. I mean, I don't know David Quint's work actually, so maybe I would be grateful if you could send me a reference or two about that.
Well, it's all about linking epic as a form to into imperial endeavors, right? And how sometimes when you have actually an epic which is a really loser of people that really lost, right? That these are they make the most outrageous political claims, right? Which themselves can actually be traced over time, like almost just inside of just an intellectual history of empire.
Can you say more? Can you give an example?
Well, I can show. You can look at the book. I mean, the perfect example in his book is Camões, and Camões is basically after the Portuguese Empire is dead. Okay, you have this author coming back and resurrecting all kinds of Virgilian forms but those particular texts, right, give birth and give energy to other literary or political aspirations in the future. So you might think about a literary text in a little bit different way. This is just a suggestion. Other than thinking about it in terms of pure selling or citation,
That's a good point. I'll look forward to reading David Quint a little bit on this. I meant it in a very, maybe it's better to say in a very limited way. By the measure of their own ambitions, they failed as writers. They really saw themselves as destined to assume this kind of position as national tastemakers and national cultural figures. And they're filled, it one of the reasons they're interesting to read, even though the literature is very bad, because they're filled with this confidence in the way that also the young men are sometimes in the sense, except, and young women too, but when you're 20 or 21 or 17 or whatever age it is, and you think that all these biographers and historians are going to be writing about you and your friends, except they actually wrote all of their thoughts about this down and published them. So it's out there to read. And Timothy Dwight writes poems, long poems, responding to Voltaire and David Hume, as if he were in this dialogue with them. I mean, and he is, but only in his own mind. One of them is called The Triumph of Infidelity. It's dedicated to Voltaire. And a British Anglican reviews it in London and claims that it must be a deist hoax designed to discredit New England Protestantism because it's so sulfurous and angry. But in another form of literature, and where they're huge winners, is that they do really write the history of the United States for the first 100+ years. And they're hugely successful at founding schools. I mean, it's not just AUB, Amherst, Oberlin, Case Western Reserve, Dartmouth, their graduate staff, Yale and Princeton, or Princeton and Princeton, not Yale, they're coming from Yale. But in the history of American education and the history of American history, Yale is the great imperial school. It comes directly out of this.
Well, this is exactly my point. This is exactly what I was saying, is that couldn't there be a kind of heritage that comes out of these poems, which is that what have we chosen are the books that we're going to force students to read in curricula in all these schools that we produce. So it's a kind of inside of that bad epic, there's also a historiographic and a sort of a reflection, or historiographic embryonic historiography, let's say, okay, which gives rise to curricula all over the place that we still live with.
They wrote American national history for over 100 years. Thomas Jefferson founds the University of Virginia in direct competition with Timothy Dwight, and he starts writing letters to all these colleges in the South, trying to convince them not to hire theologians and professors of divinity. And it's a direct competition, and they're the only ones who know, the clerics in the 18th century, the only ones who know how to write histories of people.
Yeah, we have a couple other. I just wanted to thank David for bringing together Camões, whom I wrote my dissertation on at Yale, the imperial entity, which I thought is a fascinating insight, and of course, Faulkner instantly leapt to mind. Absalom is a story of defeat, that and being a Southerner too. I guess I'm a multiple loser. Fascinating sorts of connections there. We have a question here, and then I know Fawaz wanted to ask. Joshua has a question, and Fawaz wanted, I know, to ask about the relationship of this to missions movement at AUB and history. Joshua.
I don't have the mic.
Oh, excuse me. We love to get your question right after Joshua and Fawaz. Excuse me. I'm bad with the mic today. I'm having mic trouble.
I just want to thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about the Christian aspect of the mission at home in the United States and then abroad. Because it's interesting that you touched on it only very obliquely and somewhat abstractly. With the closest I could come up with was the idea of this relatively egalitarian literate society that took shape in New England. Yeah. But I was wondering two things. The extent to which there was a kind of Protestant Christian program in the United States as part of the nationalist movement, and what role that precisely took vis-a-vis whoever they took to be their quote-unquote enemies. Yeah. And then also specifically the role, or how they saw the role of Christianization abroad when they took their show on the road, as you concluded.
Yeah. No, those are very good questions, and that's part of my book. The first question, I think the answer is, I think it was Coleridge who said that religion, and every missionary understands this, but religion is not doctrine, it's life. And this is unquestionable to 18th century New England Protestants. It's not a matter of belief, It's not a matter of having a conversion experience. The idea that you have a conversion experience and you're a member of a new religion is very, the 19th century notion of how to become religious. For them, religion was social transformation, and it was inseparable from all of these qualities of social life. Were absolutely essential to being the right kind of Protestant. The answer to your second question, what I didn't get to, but what is the next part of the story is that they weren't able to do the missions by themselves. There were two groups in America that they hated. And if you want to read terrible things about slavery or terrible things about the bourgeoisie, read their poems. What they didn't anticipate was the emergence of popular American Protestantism, which is happening simultaneously. This is basically Methodism and Baptism. They're created at the same time all this is going on. What's still today, more or less, popular American Protestantism is being created. They recoiled in horror from popular American Protestantism. They turned to the New York City and Philadelphia bourgeoisie, and that's how the missions, that's to make the missions movement. Because the New Englanders, they could never have paid for the missions movement. They didn't have the resources to launch people all over the world. But they make peace with the commercial classes of New York and Philadelphia, and that's how they do this.
Okay, wonderful. Fawaz has a question, and then this young gentleman that I neglected.
Thank you very much for this inspiring rundown of the history of New England, sort of. But I wonder, how can we connect the people who lived in that atmosphere of those blue laws, which you have mentioned? Some of them is like, it's a backward sort of community compared to what was being sent to us through the French sort of revolutionary ideas and so on. But what is the connection between that area, philosophically, socially, religiously, whatever, spiritually? What is the connection of that area with sending missionaries to China or India or Middle East, or at that early stage? Is there some spiritual drive other than nationalism?
No, that's a very good question, and I don't. I mean, some people are interveners in life, right? Some people go out and intervene in people's lives.
Here they're called shore.
Other people don't. I mean, for me, it's a foreign impulse in the sense that they do it, but I don't mean that in a punning way. But they are interveners. They have that impulse to do that, and they have. I mean, that's a missionary impulse, kind of missionary with a small m, I guess. But some people do that, not just Christians or Muslims, but they have this deep. Well, I mean, a more sophisticated answer they also have would be about the fact. Maybe a more interesting answer is the fact that they also have some kind of flexibility about what is the righteous and the true political community that one has to be a part of. And this is one of the things that's interesting about Christian missionaries, is that they are internationalists, often, not always, I'm generalizing, but they really do go everywhere still today. The Mormons are all over the world. I don't know if that is that an answer. Did I answer your question?
Yes, we could also, rejoin it, because I know there are several people here who are interested in the relationship of this to this part of the world. Please.
Yeah, I had a question. You left off in 1814, and then in 1840, this missionary movement is going on. Can you help me kind of connect the dots between those dates? Who are the figures and groups that are part of this New England philosophy and way of life, and that are there in 1814, and then kind of are on their way? Who are some of those figures and groups?
Yeah. Well, Timothy Dwight, I think Timothy Dwight is the central figure. The word I used to talk was to authorize this change. Because New Englanders were not missionaries. There are no missions, with the exception of this David Brainerd and John Eliot to the Americans. And even these are eccentric 18th century figures. I mean, if you want early modern missionaries for there's a country called Paraguay. Within 10 years of arriving in South America, the Jesuits have 100,000 Guarani Indians living on missions in South America. Those are missionaries. There's no New England missionaries until the early 19th century, really, with a couple minor exceptions. But the ABCFM is merely the largest. Between 1787 and 1827, 50 years, New Englanders go from having no missions to having, and this is just New England, not Pennsylvania, New York, and they're also founded. 927 missions in 50 years are founded, from 0 to 927. And they take place with an alliance between the clerical class and the commercial class. So those are the two classes. And different missions are affiliated to more or less strong degrees with different Christian denominations. I'll say this, none of them are Methodist or Baptist. And the Methodists and the Baptists write, they see them as upper-class bourgeois tools of oppression, and they write many, many pamphlets saying so. They're basically Anglicans, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians from the Northeast.
Yes, please.
Thank you for such a wonderful and wonderfully illuminating talk, Sam. I was wondering whether you could address how going on the road transforms the show.
Yeah, it is transformative. There's this great moment in I think it's in the John Monroe book about AUB, where the ABCFM board writes to I think it's Daniel Bliss here, or maybe it's to the faculty, I don't know, somebody here in Beirut, and says, they received all these progress reports about the curriculum and the education in school, and then the board writes back from Boston and says, well, make sure you don't denationalize them. And they say this because everything that they're doing here in Beirut and all these missions is everything that the missionaries understand what it meant to be an American or to be a civilized person. So this tension arises then, and it's usually played out in complex relations, or it's often played out in complex relations between the people in the field and the boards back in North America, who become, in essence, a sort of center-periphery conflict, and sometimes have different ideas about this. But the experience of going on the road is absolutely transformative and creates a lot of strife within these organizations and difficult relationships. I think it also leads to racialization. I think that's, the blue laws I talked about with a lot of sectarian bigotry, sectarian chauvinism. They give that up to do the missions, and to a large extent. And the commercial classes that run the missions don't care what religion, what sect you're part of. So the New Englanders give that up, but they accept this racialism. So it's a trade-off. That's a very general answer to a question that, to be answered better, would have to be almost looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Do we have some more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Sam. I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just interested in, when you talk about the Jesuits and the work that they did in South America, I think of founding of missions as in seminaries, as in religious instruction.
Yeah.
And from what I've read about Daniel Bliss and the American missionaries, they weren't founding seminaries.
No.
They were founding universities. Is that because they collaborated with the commercial class, or can you unpack that a little bit more for me?
Basically, yes. I mean, there's no theology school at AUB ever, right? I mean, George Stauber gave a talk about this a few years ago here that I read on the MIT Literature Program website. He makes this point very, very well. They never find, I mean, it's curious. There's never a theology school. It's supposed to be a Protestant mission community college, but there's never a theology school. Theology is divisive. Religion is not. If you start talking about theological doctrine, it creates all sorts of problems. Getting people to live a certain kind of civilized spiritual life is easier and less divisive. So they give up a lot of theological sophistication. 18th century New Englanders are very theologically sophisticated. The missions movement is not particularly at all.
Do we have another question? David and I can attest that we weren't required in the English department to read Timothy Dwight's epic. That might actually be how, in lieu of a seminary, you have to read that epic.
You really dropped out of the program.
Right. There's no way you can pass your master's exam without reading and memorizing at least 2 lines. You said there were no people who knew 2
I
lines.
can think of 2 perhaps. I haven't asked them, but I spent 6 months reading their poetry, and let me tell you, I felt like I was doing the Lord's work.
Well, do we have another question, or on that uplifting note, we can call it a night? December 15th, we have this wonderful talk, Wendy, who's her name? Ethnomusicologist. It will be a performance too, and she's a member of various Native American tribes, so it's a real first for us at CASAR, something interesting in a collaboration with fine arts. So please come to that, and then Mark Puchner on the 21st of December, talking about world literature. And if you did not sign up for CASAR, please do, and we're extremely grateful that you came out today. We look forward to seeing you again.